Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Mike, and I welcome you to today's roundtable discussion on the topic, a pragmatic approach to data mesh with Microsoft and Pariveda Solutions. Today, we will learn how companies can approach building a data mesh architecture. Expert speakers will share their learnings from data mesh implementation at various companies, including data domain structure, technical architecture, the role of platform and infrastructure teams, and data governance topologies. I would like to welcome our roundtable panel speakers for today. Ben Hudson, Product Management at Dremio. Pietijn Stringholt, Senior Cloud Solution Architect, Microsoft Netherlands. Sean Beard, VP Emerging Technology, Pariveda Solutions. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could be here today to tell you more about a pragmatic approach to data mesh with Microsoft and Pariveda Solution. Here's Ben.
Mike, thanks very much for the intro. And folks, thanks very much for taking the time to join us all today. In today's discussion, pragmatic approach to data mesh, we're going to split the discussion into two parts. In the first part of the discussion, we're going to level set and talk about data mesh and how we got here. So starting off with the problems with legacy existing data architectures and how data mesh solves that. The second part of the discussion, we're going to open up the floor to have a roundtable discussion with Pietijn and Sean, and we're going to have a fairly open Q&A that focuses on specifically the challenges when implementing each data mesh principle and how to address those in a pragmatic manner. So focusing on things like methodology, patterns, and observations that we've had in implementing data mesh at our customers. So with that, I'd love to pass the mic to Pietijn to give us an overview of data mesh and how we got here. And Pietijn, please let me know when I should proceed with the slides.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, great. Well, this is the first slide. And typically when customers ask me, Pietijn, what is your view on data mesh? I first explain more looking at the existing situation and why customers, organizations at all need to change. And when I talk to customers, I often see this conceptual or high-level architectural design. So on the left, you see the transactional source system. So this is where data is coming from. I often use the phrase data providers. And then often you see in the middle a lot of centralization. So one monolithic architecture, central teams, a single team. This single team holds all the knowledge and uses one book of activities to work from. You see often all data is orchestrated, integrated using a centralized or quite largely integration data model. And often, well, there's also a central platform or large central database sitting underneath this architecture. And then at last on the right, you see the analytical consumer. So this is where then the data downstream will be pushed to or will be consumed. And I feel, well, this architecture is not wrong because it has been a best practice for almost a decade. So when you, for instance, study the DAMA framework, you very much will learn about this kind of architecture. This has been the best way of doing this for many years. But nevertheless, so when you move to the next slide, when I talk to customers, I see lots of issues on this architecture. I'm not going to discuss all of these, but I will select a few. But maybe to start with the first two. So lack of data ownership. So who owns that data here in this architecture? And often what you see is data first comes from that source system and then is integrated, mixed with other data, transformed to a format from which data providers no longer could recognize their data. So then you quickly end up in a discussion. So who owns that data then? So often the source system owners, in case, for example, when there are data quality concerns, they point to the data warehousing engineers or the data lake folks and say, well, you integrated or changed my data, so I no longer take ownership of that data. On the other hand, you see the central team often pointing back towards the source system owners. Well, you delivered the data, for instance, incorrectly. I also see it's quite difficult to oversee all of these dependencies. So the more data you add, the more integrations and layers on top of layers you will see. So it's harder to follow the data and exactly see the origin. The more data you add, the more conflicts you also often have when integrating and combining data. So when harmonizing data, how to strike a good balance between keeping the original context versus making an uniform data model that it's not too meaningless to all of these parties. So it's a difficult challenge often. One of the biggest problems I see, so that central team often becomes the bottleneck, because there's one team taking care of onboarding all data, integrating all data, building out the selections, the data marts, for instance, for the consuming team. So that team is hard to scale. Of course, you can throw more people on that architecture, but then still there's this scalability. Another issue I see, there's quite a disconnect or distance between where the data is actually being produced versus where the data is being consumed. So there's always this middle team sitting in between, which then again becomes a bottleneck. And it's much more rather so technical ownership than true data ownership. And the trend in modern data management today is to move that data ownership one level up, so closer to the business. So I think therefore not without a reason, so organizations are looking into alternatives. And one is data mesh. So if we would move to the next slide. So what is data mesh then? So to me, it's about decentralization, so federation of responsibilities. And you see that, I think, most clearly with this diagram. So the big giant blue box here in the middle has now been replaced with smaller blue boxes. So there's no longer one giant central team sitting in between where the data is being produced and where the data is being consumed downstream, but instead you make teams, domains, responsible for sharing data directly to other teams or other domains. And this to me implies two things. So on one hand, you should provide the data in an easy and user-friendly way and manage that data as taking accountability and ownership of that. So there you see that word data product comes in. But additionally, I also see, well, those data products not necessarily are upfront, ideally shaped or modeled into the design data consumers would like to see it. So they most obvious then would take that data in the format or in the context of the providing domain and then transform that towards the needs on the right-hand side. So again, we have unique and different contrasting contexts always. So that's in a nutshell what I see. So to me, data mesh, it's really much more an organizational change or a way of taking ownership of data or federating responsibilities rather than a technology change. So I think maybe I also see in a way technology agnostic, so not linked to any of the technologies we find there. Of course, you need to support these domains with platforms and services to allow such a way of working. So therefore you see that underpinning gray bar where you support these teams with governance and platform infrastructure. If we move then to the next slide. So data mesh, according to Zhamak Dehghani, so founder of this concept, she advocates looking at this concept from 4 principles. So the first one is you need to align these responsibilities. And there she recommends to use domain-driven design as a methodology for setting the boundaries within your organization. I think we could have a later maybe discussion around that, whether this is the right or the best approach. But at least she recommends that. And I, in a way, agree to her. So you need to indeed do this decentralized and domain-oriented. Although what is the best way to define and shape a domain? Next, there's something called, well, you should manage your data as a product. So take ownership as it. I think this concept in a way isn't new. So if you would ask the CEO of Informatica a long time ago, he said, well, data, you should manage it as an asset. So in a way, it's no different than managing it as a product. But at least people should take ownership of the data they care about and model the data in a shape so it's most meaningful for other parties to use it quickly and easily. And then there's another principle, you should have a platform in place to allow that collaboration and distribution of data between domains and the usage of that. And preferably, well, this platform is self-service or self-serve. So domains ideally could operate on that platform very much themselves without constant help from a central platform team. And then there's another part, so federated computational governance. Federated, so it's no longer central, so other teams do data governance in a way. So it's the central team that tells other teams how to do data governance really well. But you also see that word computational here. And computational means, well, you should no longer add additional processes and forms and take away all that manual labor. So in a way, try to automate this and do it smart. So therefore you see that, hence that word computational there. So federated computational governance. So that's the last pillar, looking at data mesh. So yeah, I hope this at least sets a little bit the scene and we are all now on the same page on what data mesh is about.
Yeah. Piet-Hein, thanks very much for taking the time to walk us through the background of the data mesh and some of the big business drivers for implementing the data mesh approach at companies. So I think we've all seen it, Sean, you, myself, at our respective organizations. Data mesh has become immensely popular over the past couple of years. I think everyone has read Zhamak's papers, and for good reason as well. Every single organization has a lot of data, and the data mesh, if you look at the core principles, really promises to make data self-service and ultimately make it easier for organizations to derive value from that data and remove some of the bottlenecks that have emerged from legacy data architectures. So it is appealing. Now, one of the issues or one of the points to overcome, though, when you're reading through these original manifests, is that how does this documentation translate into practice, right? It might not always line up. So, I'd love to talk about how each of us here has implemented data mesh and actually what this looks like in practice compared to what the textbook definition looks like. So why don't we start off the roundtable, and I'll pose a question from even this organizational perspective on the right-hand side here, talking about federated computational governance. So Piet-Hein, what do your governance topologies for data mesh look like in practice for your customers, and how does it match up or vary from the data mesh literature?
Mm-hmm. I think maybe Sean, for that we would maybe best look at the slide.
And Sean, feel free to jump in after as well. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Zhamak Dehghani, she very much advocates for fine-grained alignment. So domains take ownership of their own data and model the data in a way it becomes a data product. And then that data is being shared directly peer-to-peer to other domains without that central team sitting in between. And if you study the methodology precisely, I think what you see mostly then, what she refers to is what I call fine-grained, fully federated alignment, or that fine-grained, fully federated mesh. So the bounded context or the team interdependency or the independency is quite nicely aligned also with the domain boundaries. Within the boundaries of that domain, you take ownership of the data, model the data, and ship these data products directly to other domains. And ultimately, all of these teams also use independent services from one and another. So there's no dependency anymore between all of these teams. Companies really like this approach because you could, in parallel, allow multiple teams to operate on their data and build data products in parallel. Also do the same on the consuming side. So have multiple teams independently consume data from all of these different domains. So it's a very attractive model. However, in practice, what I see is, take, for instance, network connectivity. How should you manage that between all of these domains? You see quite a number of lines. So imagine you're in a situation where you're on premises and maybe on different clouds. So it's highly likely that there's a central team then sitting in between overseeing all the network connectivity or the private endpoints. So that immediately, I think, raises a concern looking at the huge number of lines. Alternatively, you would ask domains to themselves manage the network. But this, again, also raises massive security concerns because how well do these domains know how to manage the network? So you might end up in a situation where you have security breaches over your data. So in practice, what I see much more is organizations choose the topology in the middle, up, so the fine-grained, but more fully governed mesh. So it more follows an hub and spoke, a traditional model, where the data is distributed via a central logical entity. So still domains take ownership of their data. They model the data in a shape like that it becomes a data product. But the only difference, so it's a small nuance to data mesh. Those data products then are routed, for instance, via a central logical construct. You could have a theoretical debate whether this is exactly a data mesh. Yes, you have, again, maybe a bottleneck, maybe brought back here into your architecture, but it's in practice mostly what I see. Another model sometimes I see where some organizations, they do some data mesh because there's this maturity curve or this learning curve. Not all teams are that highly skilled enough. So I see also a lot of organizations, they implement some data mesh. So there might be maybe some central onboarding for complex administrations or source systems, maybe even a central team sometimes taking ownership of that data or helping modeling that data into a data product. But sometimes on the right-hand side or in other parts, you see more mesh kind of architecture being applied. Another model I also sometimes see, mostly with customers who work within manufacturing or product development, they organize their domains in value chains. And these value chains are often spanning across many systems. So those domains then are a bit more larger, and those teams take accountability of multiple systems. Between these systems, you then typically see more tight coupling for the operational nature and how these teams work, but only then when crossing the boundaries of these domains, teams make data products and ship these between one another. Sometimes I also see what I call quite coarse-grained aligned meshes, where organizations take the organizational boundary as the starting point for a domain, and they group together then quite a large number of systems and applications. And then within this boundary, they manage the data as a whole. Big drawback I see with this model, you have that risk again of creating large monoliths. So this model, I would say, stands most far away from an actual true data mesh. And then sometimes you even see combinations where you organize your domain structures in a way it's quite coarse-grained, but then still with that central layer of distribution in between. So that's another topology you could follow. And I see, when talking to customers, all of these different approaches, and sometimes even combined. So if you take a look at the next slide, you could even end up in a situation like this, where a part of your organization ships and distributes all data products using a central layer. On other parts, you see that more fine-grained federated approach like Samak, Negani advocates for, and sometimes in other parts of the organization, a bit more or a higher degree of centralization. So still a monolith, for example, when you need to combine and integrate an awful lot of data for good reasons, then you could also end up with a more monolithic approach. So you see also combinations of all of these topologies. And having that said, the topology you start with not necessarily always has to be the topology you end with. So it's a transition as well, and a journey you're on. So
yeah, I would definitely agree that it's a journey for a lot of organizations. I mean, historically, governance has been treated more of a compliance exercise that gets bolted onto projects at the end because they want to pass an audit or some sort, right? Which is still as as regulatory and governmental compliance becomes stricter and stricter, this still needs to be a concern, which I think the things that we've seen organizations struggle with is accountability. So as we start to distribute ownership of data throughout the enterprise, where I think in a very finely tuned world, it would be very optimized to run in the fine-grained, fully federated, but that's also got to come with a large degree of accountability. We've got a governance, you know, and a lot of our clients, we build a governance charter, so we understand how are we going to define data quality? How are we going to define a quality data source? What are the regulatory things we need to worry about? And so how do we then start driving enforcement of that throughout to make sure that everybody's compliant? Because it only takes one time to get your name on the front page of a paper, right? And then you've got all the things that can happen as a result. That you mentioned that, P-Time, of security vulnerabilities. And so, you know, one of the things that we've done on a lot of our approaches over the last number of years as it relates to governance is we want to, like, we started on day one as part of our data platform because we want it to be incorporated as part of the organization. Because as we start to get into this, and I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit later as well, but also what we want to do with machine learning, AI, all the different consumers of the data that's going to be there, how do we provide an experimentation platform? How do we allow you to safely experiment and iterate quickly across large data sets without necessarily exposing the wrong type of data and things like that?
Mm-hmm. In that respect, maybe also...
Go ahead.
Sorry, in that respect, also interesting to say, so Mak in her book, she often draws a parallel between data mesh and microservices. And what I see also among customers, they interpret that, so the view on microservices as, well, domains have complete jurisdiction or freedom over whatever technology or platform they're allowed to choose. I also feel this is wrong. So that transition, even though you're planning to go for fully federated, fine-grained data mesh, still requires you to standardize on certain capabilities and services.
I think to your point, Pitain, I was going to ask about how this governance topology is dictated by the underlying technology as well, because, you know, data mesh, we have our pillars, we talk about governance, right? Sean, massively important as you move, like, for everyone moving forward. And if you want to think about data as a product, that brings an even higher level of importance to data governance. For example, what does it mean for data to be a product, right? Aside from being a data set, now if you've got different domains being responsible for owning their data, they have to, you know, whose responsibility is it to ensure that data set is meeting a certain SLA, either for availability or for performance, or how is it, how are you doing schema enforcement or making sure you have the right join keys, right? So I think this is very interrelated to what happens under the hood.
Yeah, I think spot on, and therefore you still need to have a central authority, I feel, overseeing any of the topologies you would like to implement. So without, then if domains take ownership of all these kind of top-down discussions, yes, I think, and this is also the risk I see with data mesh. So you should not pivot in an extreme direction of too much federation where there's no central authority anymore or at all overseeing all of these kind of discussions. So you need to set standards and conform domains to a certain way of working.
Yeah.
And I think as we talk about data as a product, I think that's an interesting one, right? Because if we think about the definition of a product, right, it's something that provides a service. And so when you mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but you mentioned things about ownership, like, and who establishes the SLAs, right? So when we think about how we've looked at data as a product, it is really the owner, or it is the end. It's the end thing that the consumer of that data is using. They're going to tell us whether or not it's performing the way it needs to. They're going to tell us whether or not it's doing it. And because even from Pitain's diagrams earlier, you've got the domains, but then you've got the consumption domain pieces. So it starts getting a little different as to who owns that actual product that's there. And then when we think about products, like we've even gone through an exercise where we start managing it in a product lifecycle process where we treat it like we would any other product that's there, so that it can have a sunrise and a sunset in its life cycle and know when it's time for it, it's no longer needed. And so I think as we look at data as a product, it really starts to be, how do we do appropriate testing at the time the product is created? How do we start really driving at what those requirements are? And what we've done a lot of is we have this process or methodology that we call right to left thinking, that all of our data platform, our pipelines and everything starts with sitting down with the consumers and saying, well, you've got use case A. Now let's draw out exactly what it's going to take to satisfy that use case. And we work our way back through all the platform data into the domains to understand what it is we need, so that we're only building what we need and not relying on, and that's something we use to protect against something we see a lot of the, and you see this more with canonical models, of the if we build it, they will come methodology of, I'm going to give you these models, and then you get run into the 80-20 rule at that point, where those models only do 80% of what I need. So it kind of protects against all of that by really defining the product, and then the ownership of that product, it really starts being in the hands of the consumer for that. So
I think having that said, you then, you already said it, well, those domain models or canonical models, I think that implies you also have a relationship then with the domain and also the boundaries you set within the organization, right?
correct. Yeah, and how we've constructed those products. Yes. But what we try to do is get away from that, because canonical models tend to, this is kind of where, in my mind, data mesh is really more appetizing, and really is why we need to look at it, is because canonical models tend to cause more problems, because they force you to shoehorn, if you will, your process and how you look at the world into a single space, as opposed to letting each domain define that and then going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes an observation I have on that is lots of organizations bring up that reusability concern, and you often see domains are intertwined or so by nature, so for the operational world, application distribute sometimes some data. So you see operational systems hold parts. So let me give an example where the order management system also holds pieces of the customer management system, because otherwise you could not enter an order and link it to a customer. But then how do you ensure you could, at the end, still join that data between these two different domains? And I think you still then need to have some kind of overarching model overseeing the interdependencies between all of these different domains and systems. So,
yeah.
What is your view on
I
that?
think that. Oh, I was about to say that this just ties into the role of the central governance team as well, right? We all know that everyone's going to have to well, the aim of the data mesh is to be able to more effectively consume each other's data, and to make it easier for domains to share their data as well. So by that, right, by that direction, it's got to be up to someone. And I think I'd love your thoughts on this. The central governance team should be, you have the freedom to, go to a certain extent, but to ensure interoperability, then you have to define some common metadata or some common fields inside your data in order to ensure that your data products will play well with others and they can blend and join their data. I think the other concern around data reusability is data proliferation and data copies, to put it crudely as well. For example, what happens if you want to publish your data to a shared zone, right? Are you going to create a physical copy? And if someone takes that copy, just drawing it back to the ownership, who's responsible for notifying who if you update that copy of data? For example, I take P-Tine's customer records data, I go and append some data myself because I think it's useful, but after I've done that, who has to ensure that P-Tine's copy is up to date with mine, right? But it's just a question of ownership at the end of the day. But.
Well, I think like that problem, that's, and I think it's really interesting because I started my career definitely in the software space. And so one of the things that I've seen is that the data space and the software space are merging to a degree where they're starting to become somewhere indistinguishable. So like for example, to solve that problem, and to really and this kind of gets a little bit into the weeds, is looking at things like pulling from event-driven architectures you find in more of your application space, to where you have those data. You have that classic pub sub kind of model where when changes occur, then you have the domains that need to listen for those changes or listening for those changes. So you have microservices that are sitting there waiting for an update. Because like notorious, or not notorious, but an example of this would be like an SAP system like HANA. Updates are coming in, orders are changing, customers changing address, whatever those changes need to be. Well, there's an event that needs to get generated that then can be consumed, so all the domains can update the records that they need to update, if they're listening for it. And that all does play into the governance, because then we start talking about, okay, that data that's being updated, let's say it's a customer name, like it's a person's name. Well, then there's certain protections that need to be given to that data. There's certain things that can't be seen. And so we can talk about what de-identification or encryption strategies need to be as it kind of gets distributed throughout. And that's where it goes back to an accountability strategy, where how do we hold those domains accountable for making sure they're treating the data the way they're supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting points. I think, in my previous role, we also had constant discussions. So when are you still looking at the operational plane, whether it's more the data side, for instance? And I think the common denominator is when these events, for instance, carry the data, so state carrying events. Yes. I think those kind of events you could very well use also for data distribution. Well, common notifications, which don't carry much state, I feel are better aligned with the operational world. But yeah, for sure, you need to set standards and also guide this properly.
Yeah, I think that that alludes to the evolution of the governance team, right? So one question I'll ask both of you is, we have the central governance team as part of your data management architecture. How does their role evolve from the previous architectures, the old monolithic way, to the data mesh in this more decentralized fashion? What are the major differences here that you've seen in practice?
To me, the shift, so instead of executing on all that work, so what you traditionally saw, it's much more now the modern data governance team should prescribe what other teams should do in that respect to manage the data according to the enterprise standards. So it's a shift from central to decentral in that way. But I feel that also changes the role of that governance team, and that team also needs to be supported with capabilities that allow for that federated approach. If it's still all sitting central, then.
Yeah, and then that means, so they provide the guidance, but for example, if they need to enforce some sort of data quality, is it on them to implement those checks as well? So if they need to implement any contracts or APIs that check for the quality of data, is it on that team as well to do so, that the domain teams can leverage to make sure their data is in line?
In some extent, I would say yes. Yeah, so that team should also provide services or capabilities to allow, for example, establishing contracts between domains. So it should not be up to domains to themselves to decide what a data contract would look like. No, I feel the central team should develop a capability, offer that as a service towards those other teams. So then those other teams should act upon that service and use that and conform even their way of working to that respect.
And I think there's additional roles that historically haven't been there that get added into this to help shepherd that process, right? So, I know that data steward is one that most people have heard of at this point. But there's also we've defined things like data catalysts, data product managers. It's really starting to drive that understanding of having the why is this important? What is it we're trying to accomplish, and how are we going to do it? And then within the governance structure, there needs to be a way to make sure that those activities are happening, so that when a data quality issue does arise, right, you have a way of getting the right people engaged to get it fixed based on what those governance policies need to be. And it may be like, in a lot of ways, if I see bad data coming in from an upstream service, well, let's fix that, and let's not bring low data quality into our platform. But then we have the roles that are there to help try to enforce that and to push back on those upstream systems to make sure that they're there. And I see the same things evolving between domains, so that you have a steward that once that contract is defined on what quality means in that context, then you have the governance roles there to make sure that if something does go wrong, that you've got the ability to get it rectified upstream from the platform.
Yes.
How big of so in my experience, data mesh and the evolution of those roles has been a big mindset shift, right? Data mesh, it's an approach, it's an organizational change. I think anyone adopting the technology to make the data mesh possible, it's a double-edged sword, right? There's two prongs to tackle. Number one is implementing the infrastructure as a platform, but I think the even bigger lift, to your point, Sean, is the evolution of roles, right? Changing the behavior of ownership and whose responsibility is it to enforce the quality and to enforce the regulations of the data to ensure you stay within the bounds that you set for the company. So in your experiences, do you see the same thing where the biggest change rather is on the organizational side and changing the mindset?
So I certainly do. I've been through, and then previous to data, helping organizations make a switch to a DevOps mindset. And now what we're doing is we're helping them make that switch, where we kind of we've adopted moving to a data ops mindset. Because governance always caused such a reaction with people, we actually tried to just stop using the word altogether and just call it data ops and see if we can make that work to change people's ideas about it. But it goes through and it definitely getting the cultural shifts. It's a process that they start going through, and it starts with, let's start with one data pipeline. Let's start with one use case. Let's let the organization learn from that experience, and then we can start building on that from there. And all the time, we're building up a broader governance capability. We're building up the need and understanding of what those roles need to accomplish as we're slowly building up one use case at a time. And that's been fairly effective for our clients in terms of them being able to understand and own how they're going to start managing their data differently.
I think those roles also still need to be clarified. Samak, in a way, I feel she oversimplifies that role name of a data owner. It's more a composite role, I would say, that maybe and underneath you have various sub roles. So often I see at organizations, they organize them differently than what you see in the book of Samak. So there's this role of an application owner, data steward, business owner. So data owner, yes, rolls up. It's more a composite role rather than I see it exactly being implemented the way it's being described in that book. So there I also would like to make a nuance. But still, yes, it's a major shift, and I fully agree. It's data ops is a good recommendation to look at first initially.
And I think I think one of the things we kind of talk about in that also is when we talk about it from an organizational perspective is, a lot of what data mesh is it's a data implementation of some core data-driven design principles that are there. And when we think about that, what we're really establishing when we talk about how a contract between domains, is we're establishing a common vocabulary. We're establishing a language for how we're going to talk about things with each other. And so I think as we think about things like, things like a data catalog, establishing data dictionaries, being able to understand, like in a context, what these things mean, and being able to have that common thing defined is really important to make sure that those domains will be able to smoothly talk to each other, because pretty much your data quality rules and all of your processes are going to be, and even a semantic layer will be driven from that common language, or that common architecture piece.
Mm-hmm. I think that's more the Datafabric approach, the last one you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, also that part I feel misses. So in data mesh. So how could we make the consumption side much more intelligent, automated, smart in a way? And I think there these self-service Datafabric kind of features also should be added here in this architecture.
Mm-hmm. Are there any specific consumption features that your clients are particularly interested in implementing with regards to, bringing some of the Datafabric capabilities into a data mesh approach?
Who are you asking?
You. As you're talking about bringing some Datafabric capabilities into the consumption side of data mesh. Anything particular?
So self-service. So instead of what I still see often reaching out to central infrastructure team, asking them to provision those services on behalf of them, they would rather see an approach where they could self-service, provision these services in that respect. I think more intuitive ways of sharing data, making contracts, learning about the context in how the data has been created, constructed.
Yep.
Sharing the data more easily with external parties is another discussion I often have. So those are services I see in high demand.
And we're seeing a lot more desire, at least for real time, for being able to have real-time data processing, especially when we think about incorporating digital twin technologies, IoT, being able to do more advanced analytics and processing to not only understand what is happening from a situational awareness perspective, but also being able to respond to things that are happening in an environment. So.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel vendors, especially those who design more the business software applications, also have an important role to play here to make the data available much more easily. Still, it's a lot of work to take the data out from that complex transactional system and then model it into the shape or design of a data product. I wish these vendors do better in making the data available in a user-friendly way, or you could semantically easily integrate that data for whatever purpose you would like to consume it for. So that's, if there are any vendors listening, please hear out.
Yeah, how to take that operational data and make it available for downstream analysis, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and this whole data pipeline discussions and data. It's an awful lot of data engineering work mostly, which takes a lot of time. And I think then before the actual consumers could start consume any data, often you see months pass by because that whole uplift of taking data out, modeling it into that ideal shape still needs to take place first.
Mm-hmm. So I think we are at the 45-minute mark. This has been a fantastic discussion. I think just a lot of back and forth on touching upon basically all of the 4 principles here, really just going around and around here. But I wanted to cap off this discussion with one final question to you both. Right? For anyone looking to implement a data mesh approach, if you had one piece of advice you would provide to anyone looking or interested in the data mesh approach, what would you give? what would you ask them to focus on?
Oh, good question. It's a massive transition. I see it mostly works well if you do it top down. So ensure you get the mandate, the attention. Also do it piecemeal. So do not start it on all places of your organization, but yeah, do it really small, learn quick, fail fast. And that whole domain decomposition. So domain-driven design worked really well when digging up complexity or untangling application interfaces. But I feel in practice it does not work well when designing an end-to-end landscape with hundreds or thousands of applications even. So for that, you need to have a more nuanced or different approach. So there I recommend business architecture as a starting point. This works best, also is my experience.
Thanks for that recommendation. I think that reminds me of, starting small reminds me of Sean's analogy, or Sean's experience with starting with one use case and getting the buy-in from the entire team, right? And also the top down, of course, it's an organizational change, right? Your organizational structure has to reflect the intent which you're moving. So, Sean, any advice from your side?
Yeah, it follows a lot of what P-Time said as well. I mean, one of the things I've told my clients a lot is, what you want to do is don't go for the moonshot. It's all about laps around the track. There's a friend of mine that reminded me of that quite a while ago, and it's all about take small iterative approaches. Make sure because it is a huge transition. It is shifting the relationship that the organization has with its data, and so you want to make sure that as you go through, you understand what those shifts are. And then you understand the nuance in your organization's data. And you're not going to see that if you suddenly come in and I remember, a number of years ago, it was every 5 years you would come in and rebuild your data warehouse. You'd get a budget to go rebuild the data warehouse. And so, you're not going to achieve success by trying to do that. So it's always, just remember, it's always just laps around the track.
It's like rebuilding your organization rather than rebuilding a data warehouse, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a big shift, but hopefully with a big impact for the organization. Right? This is why people are looking to data mesh as a better approach to data management. So, folks, thank you so much for your input today. I think this has been a really, really great and productive discussion. Really value your experience from the field and working with your customers, and value this really holistic approach to implementing data mesh in a pragmatic manner as well. And also challenging the literature too. Right, we have the literature. It's our job to make sure, understand how it really looks in practice, right? Bringing it to life. And it helps reinforce the feedback to anyone else looking to implement. So thank you once again, really appreciate it. And I think we will open up the floor to Q&A now.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, P-Time, and thank you, Sean. With that insightful roundtable discussion, we'll open it up to everyone to ask their questions. Question number one that came in: do you see a separate catalog for managing tracking the mesh data access on the consumer producer separated from data catalog? P-Time, Sean, please jump in. Let us know what you think.
It very well depends. I see most organizations, they take the approach of having one end-to-end catalog for all their data. Although I also see sometimes situations where domain is larger and they have this desire to manage and also catalog the data themselves within the boundaries of that larger domain. So then you have sometimes this hybrid combination. Also depends sometimes the approaches I see organizations take. So sometimes they scan all data, but also sometimes I see they scan only the most important data, for example, only the data products. But then there's still this desire left to manage, locally managed, to scan and catalog locally managed data. So for that, you could think of scenarios of having additional catalogs as well. So again, to conclude, it depends.
Yeah, and I kind of feel a lot like a consultant giving that same answer. But yeah, like Piton, I've seen kind of both things happen where it's been a case by case basis. By and large, I think if I think about it just from my personal perspective, I like the idea of having a single data catalog simply because if I think about the role of what the data catalog can play in the mesh, it's kind of a supervisory type role. It's providing supervision. So being able to have that single data catalog point can be very powerful. Plus, when we think about the other roles that catalog is providing in terms of discoverability and trustworthiness from a self-service perspective, it starts to make a lot of sense to keep things all into a single catalog.
Thank you, Piton. Thank you, Sean. Next question. Do you see data access policy being defined, enforced locally, and some defined, enforced centrally?
It's funny. I feel it's more like the same situation like with the catalog. So yeah, preferably. So when the concerns are cross-domain, you see typically it's managed centrally. But within the boundaries of a domain, you see more that notion of managing these security policies locally. So when you have a local instance and a local data warehouse or data lake deployed within the boundaries of a domain, yes, then more typically you have local policies then.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's an interesting one because to me I view it as it's a delicate balance that has to exist between the organizational policies that have to be there, and these could be regulatory policies, these could be data access or data definitions and things that happen at more of the organizational or global level. And so it's almost this balance of how do you actually keep things in equilibrium between what needs to be managed globally versus what needs to be managed locally. And that's where things like we've used things like data governance charters, where the data governance leaders are actually trying to figure out where those lines are actually drawn. In a comment that Ravi made earlier, he said that they would do zero trust with IPv6 for these domains, which I have seen that as well, but that's really putting authorization and access at a global level. So how would that impact the way domains are defining their own, they would have their own way of needing to define their own access to the data within the domain. So it's trying to find that right delicate balance between the two. And what we've seen is having a governance charter and having that governance leadership make those decisions or start hammering out what those decisions need to be.
Thank you. With time coming pretty close, we have one more questions. And if any question hasn't been answered, we'll definitely get the team analysts provide them in. Here is, in terms of championing those first use cases, are there any department, roles, functional area that you found who are most ready and capable of embracing this ownership and mindset shift?
My lessons learned are it's much more about communication and setting a sample for the rest of the organization. So you should think well upfront. So what is the sample you would like to set? So take a use case that represents the entire organization, adds preferably a lot of value, but is also realistic at the same time. And it's not easy, but I feel the accent should be placed more on that rather than more technology-wise finding the most ideal use case. Sean, maybe anything to add from your side?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think to make that shift a little easier, just to add on, is those use cases would be something that's fairly well understood, so that you can also have ways of testing it in the end to make sure that what you're doing is right or good, or however that needs to be defined. But absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I would agree with starting small with one use case, get it off the ground. An example that really exemplifies some of the tenets that data mesh talks about, like the need to share data efficiently between different domains, for example.
Right? Let's try one last question. A question came in, P-Time, and of course, Sean and Ben, definitely. I'm gonna ask this one. Most of the discussion about data mesh tends to focus on transforming legacy environment. What advice would you give to companies who have greenfield opportunities, building a new data architecture from the ground up?
Well, good question. Use modern technologies whenever where possible. Set the boundaries really fine-grained, immediately upfront. Also align it with your business architecture, so your business domains should be the starting point. Interoperability standards. Choose modern technologies. Sean, anything to add maybe from your side?
Yeah, I think as kind of an approach, I still think starting small is going to be there. It's also, with the organization is still going to need to learn, especially from a greenfield. You're going to learn how you're going to do this. Now you have the advantage of not having a lot of legacy that needs to be converted or taken into account, but you will still need to learn how all of these pieces are going to work together. And in some cases, it may be a little harder, because I think of the conversion between, if I think back to software, where we went from big monolithic systems into microservices, it was relatively not easy, but it was easier of moving into from monoliths into microservices, because the functionality was really well understood, and we understood how we could gauge and measure against what we were doing. And even starting with a microservices structure from Greenfield was a lot harder, because we didn't have all those understandings and learnings. And so I would say, take it slow. It's kind of like what I said in the last with the roundtable was laps around the track. Just allow yourself to learn. Because there's going to be a lot to learn from it.
Yeah. I would add on, think about the use cases that you want to enable with your architecture right now, but also think about how you'll, so to Sean's point, how you're going to grow those use cases in the future and expand. So how do you stay open to new technologies or new use cases that might emerge, a different analytics pattern, or a different type of analyses that you want to perform? How do you ensure that you're going to be able to take those new use cases on quickly without a big, massive overhaul in future? But to Sean and Betine's point, you're in a good position if you're starting greenfield, because you don't have the burden and the overhead of having to migrate from a legacy architecture.
Thank you, P-Time. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Ben. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's roundtable discussion. We'll close the Q&A session right now. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. See you next time.